Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is Professor Paul Hicks talking about philosophy again. And today we're going to talk about the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma comes out of Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a character who, when Socrates is on the courthouse steps, he finds Euthyphro. Euthyphro is taking and charging his father with a crime of murder for killing a slave, and that would have been against what the gods wanted at the time. And so Socrates says to Euthyphro, you must be rather have very strong conviction about what is right and wrong in order to do something which appears to be wrong. And of course Euthyphro thinks he does, because he can understand. He says he's a pious man and he understands what the gods want and what the gods command, and that simply is what is to do right and what is to do wrong. So what it is to do right under this particular theory for Euthyphro is to do whatever the gods command, that is to be a pious person, and to do wrong is to do whatever the gods prohibit. Okay, let me go ahead and update you just a little bit on the Euthyphro dilemma. I want to talk to you about it within reference to the religions that we actually have today. So what's key here to understand the Euthyphro is this question: do we need God in order to be moral? Do we need God in order to understand ethics? Is God relevant to morality or ethics or not? So what this is a challenge to is what we actually call the divine command theory, where people that hold the divine command theory have argued that the very definition of right is to do what God commands, and the very definition of wrong is to do what God prohibits, so that we understand right and wrong as analytic statements, right? We understand them just by the very meaning of what these types of terms are, that right simply means God's command, and wrong simply means God's prohibitions, right? So let's think about this for just a little bit. Is something right because God commands it? Or does God command us to do something right because he knows in his infinite wisdom that would say bring about the best consequences? What is the very nature of right or wrong? And so people that hold divine command theory are saying what is right is to follow God's commands. That is the very definition of what rightness means. But is this true? I mean, let's think about, often when we talk about what's right or wrong or what's ethical, we'll talk something about consequences. This is just one particular theory, right? Consequentialism. And so maybe for some people what is right is that we bring about the best consequences. What is wrong is to bring about worse consequences. Now, isn't it possible that God, in his infinite wisdom, knows what are the good consequences, and so he commands us to do whatever act brings about good consequences? This is important, because if this is true, then God commands us to bring about the best consequences. But notice that what makes something right isn't that God commands it. It's that makes something right is to bring about the best consequences. God's only commanding it because he knows what brings about the best consequences. And so something's not right simply because God commands it. It is right because it brings the best consequences. You understand the difference here? So think of it this way. God does command us to do certain actions. If you believe in God and you're going to take religion, God commands us to do certain actions. But why does he command us to do those actions? See, the problem is if you're going to hold something along the lines that God's command isn't in and of itself what makes something right, then why does God command us to do what God commands us to do? So you end up having a problem. Is God being a rational, reasonable person or not? So let's just lay out what we mean here. So think about this. If it might be the exact same thing that what God commands us to do and what is right, but that doesn't mean that God's command defines what is right. So think of it this way. So think of it this way. Let's just, for the sake of argument, hold that things that have a kidney are also things that have a heart. And things that have a heart happen to be the same things that are things that have a kidney. Does it mean then having a kidney means having a heart? Now, it might be the case that if you have a kidney, you also have a heart. But if we were to try to understand the statement or the phrase, things that have a kidney, we're trying to understand what is the meaning of that phrase. It just happens to be true that things that have a kidney also have a heart. But is that what it means to have a kidney? I mean, do you understand this distinction that we're making? Does having a kidney mean the same thing as having a heart? I don't think so. I think that having a kidney means having a kidney. The fact that you also have a heart is irrelevant to whether you have a kidney. And so there seems to be a problem. All right, so let's try to think of some reasons here that people really do like divine command theory. One reason that people like divine command theory is what we call the linguistic argument. That is, we should just accept the argument simply because obligatory means, in a moral sense, to be commanded by God. The problem is that it's not readily apparent that just because one speaks of an action as being obligatory and not commanded by God, that they contradict themselves. That is, can I use the term that something is obligatory or not and be an atheist? If I can do that meaningfully, then the linguistic argument falls apart. So if you're an atheist and you want to talk about what is right and what is wrong, is that logically possible? It seems to be logically possible. So it seems that people can talk about what is right and what is wrong without any sort of reference to God whatsoever. There's, of course, religious arguments in favor of this, that they appeal to the nature of God himself. They argue that since God is the creator of all things, there cannot be any moral standards or principles independent of God. But look, if this were true, then God would not be the creator of all things. Since God is the creator of all things, then we are committed to divine command theory. We're going to talk about this in just a bit, so we'll hold off on that. Another reason that people like divine command theory is that it provides some sort of moral objectivity. That is, it tells us that something really is right and something really is wrong. It saves us from relativism and the problems that are there for relativism. Here's the problem for this theory, is that it's not the only moral theory which can do this. Right? I mean, if you're interested in ethics and understanding moral theories, you should take a course on ethics. So those are some reasons that people have actually accepted divine command theory. So now let's get really into the Euthyphro dilemma. So remember what I said. Does God command that we do obligatory actions because they are obligatory, or is some action obligatory because God commands it? So let's try to appreciate the force of this particular argument. Let's lay out some qualities of God. So when we talk about God, what type of God are we talking about? Well, there's a couple properties that we tend to think God should have. That is, God is the creator of everything. Right? Two, the second God characteristic is that God is fully rational. That is, God has reasons for all of his actions. Everything he's done is done for a reason and is done with complete wisdom. Third characteristic of God is moral goodness, or omnibenevolence. That is, God is morally perfect. He is good to the fullest possible sense. He possesses every moral perfection to the highest possible degrees. And so, look, if the theist accepts these qualities of God, then now they're forced into accepting two options. One, what is right and wrong depends on God's commands, in the sense that his commands alone are what makes action right or wrong. That's pure divine command theory. Or they could accept God commands us to perform certain actions and refrain from performing others because certain actions are right and others are wrong. And being the fully rational God that he is, he knows what is right and wrong. Since he's omnibenevolent, that is, he's perfectly morally good, he commands humanity that derive from his moral knowledge. So now the dilemma can be explained in in a couple ways. So, if one embraces the divine command theory, then one is forced to give up the second characteristic of God. That is, that God does everything for a reason, and He commands it because of His infinite wisdom. This means that God could just as easily commanded for us not to keep promises or to ignore how our actions affected others. There's no reason why He chose for us to keep promises. He just commands that we do. Right? So to suppose that God has reasons for His commands is to reject the divine command theory. All right, well, furthermore, if we accept the divine command theory, then God's goodness does not make sense. What could it mean to say that God is good? I mean, it would mean that God is good because He commands Himself? Are we going to say that God is good just because God says He's good? That seems kind of odd. I mean, we would never accept that from somebody else. He would not be good in virtue of some objective standards. There would be no standards by which goodness can be measured. And so to say that God is good is not, that wouldn't make any real sense. To say God is good when there is no objective moral standards, what does that mean to say He is good? Once again, you're just getting down to this idea that God is good because He commands Himself to be good. Is that what we really want to say? So that seems to be a particular problem. So if we accept the second option, then divine command theory is just rejected outright. Also, accepting the second option causes problems for the theist in accepting the first characteristic of God. If we accept that right and wrong exists independent of God, then we are rejecting that God created right and wrong. And then right and wrong would therefore exist independent of God. All right. So what possible ways might a theist have to hold on to those God characteristics? One, there's an important sense in which what is right and wrong depends on God's creative choices and therefore depends on God. And that the theist there should accept that the idea that there are basic facts about what is right or wrong, and that's ultimately going to reject divine command theory in its pure form. So think of it this way, there are many ways that God could have created the world. But be it as it may, God did create us in a very certain way. He created us to be mortal. He created us to where we can be harmed. He commands and wants us to develop certain talents and capacities. We are created in an environment with limited resources. We must toil for food and shelter. Right? This is, in fact, the universe that God actually created. Now, so God created us with a certain nature to exist in a certain environment. Okay, I'm going to give you an analogy here. Suppose that I wanted to build an engine. Now, I could build an engine in several different ways. I can build one that runs on vegetable oil. I can build one that runs on steam, water. I can build one that runs on gasoline, or whatever. Suppose that I build an engine that happens to run on vegetable oil. Now, in some sense, it would be wrong to put gasoline in my engine because it's not going to run. But yet, it was still I that created the engine. So what is good for my engine is derived from me, the creator. So in this way, we can hold that what is right came from God because He chose to create us in a particular way, in a particular environment. Also, that there are facts that are objectively right and wrong due to our nature. But if you get back to this idea that there are facts which are right and wrong, you have to give up the divine command theory. Something is not right or wrong simply because God commands it. Something's not wrong simply because God commands it. Something is wrong for other reasons. And if you accept that, God is no longer necessary to ethics and morality. All we would have to do is find out what are the reasons for why something is right and why is something wrong. What are the reasons for why God commands us or prohibits us from doing certain actions? Once you find those reasons, then you get rid of God altogether and it's not necessary. God is not necessary to understanding right and wrong from this position. Okay, so think about the Euthyphro for a little bit, and if you have any questions, please contact me. Feel free to email me, And I look forward to talking to you. Have a good day, guys.